Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. We are all awaiting whatever we're awaiting at this point. We're all doing it sequestered, at least you should be if you're not. Got a guy here that is sequestered up in Pennsylvania. He is, waiting delivery at his palatial estate along with his brother, waiting on the WWE, waiting on opening day, just sitting there staring at the screen like poltergeist. Luke Jones joins us now. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net, and very, very active in, here's the weird part. Like, we're WNST.net, right? Like, so we need headlines for sports every day. We need games. We need basketball and football and hockey and golf and all that stuff. But instead, at least the Ravens are working this week. No one else. You and I are working, and the Ravens are working this week. And I can't say that I'm shocked on a Sunday that Calais Campbell winds up in a Ravens jersey, and this is big news if we ever play football again. And it feels like football might be the one sport that's the least effed up of all of this because we have until September to get it going. The Ravens do not rest, not during a pampering period, not during a pandemic, correct?
Correct. I mean, think about from the last point you and I talked, Matt Judon receives the franchise tag on Saturday. A very small, minor deal, but they re-signed DeAnthony Thomas to presumably be in the return mix, although I don't think that's set in stone by any stretch. But the big move, which could end up being the biggest move of the offseason for the Ravens, is the acquisition of Pro Bowl defensive end Calais Campbell from Jacksonville. I mean, this is a guy who has been a legitimate Pro Bowl caliber defensive lineman for a long time, even going back to his days in Arizona.
He's in the Hall of pretty good, right? If he came here and put out 4 serious Suggsy-like seasons, he'd go to the Hall of Fame, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's difficult about it is he's going to be 34 on September 1st. So this isn't a long-term kind of play, but when you look at how he's played and when you read football websites like Pro Football Focus, where they grade players and they track how they play year by year, not just looking at the raw stats, you see lots of people say that Calais Campbell's been a better player in his 30s than he was in his 20s, which is saying something. I mean, that's pretty impressive.
Well, and he's also never really been on a great team in a long time. I mean, he hasn't been around greatness. He's been around some decent Arizona teams through the years, but. Yeah. By and large, when you play for the Arizona Cardinals and the Jacksonville Jaguars, you're an invisible NFL player to some degree, right?
Sure. I mean, you look.
Ask Larry Fitzgerald, who could walk through airports, right?
Early in his career in Arizona, he played on some really good teams, and then a couple years ago in Jacksonville, when they got to the AFC Championship, and they were leading Tom Brady and the Patriots in the second half of that game. But beyond that, you're right. I mean, this is a guy who has been in relative, I don't want to say anonymity, because I think people that really know football have been aware of Calais Campbell, but certainly not a household name in the same way that you look at some other, even defensive standouts around the league. But this guy can play. And immediately, and there's been some murmurings, and certainly when you talk about someone who's scheduled to make $15 million going into his age 34 season for a team that's very clearly rebuilding in Jacksonville, there had been talk that he would either be a cap casualty or be someone that would be targeted for a trade. And certainly that's where Eric DeCosta swooped in and ponied up a fifth-round pick, the same fifth-round pick that the Ravens acquired for Corey Vedvik back in August, which is just kind of insane to think about the sequencing there. But, I mean, this is a huge addition for the Ravens that I think, realistically speaking, if he can give you a really good 2020, and then it sounds like it's going to be a 2-year deal that they're going to kind of ease the cap number a little bit for 2020. If he can be okay for another season after that, then to me, this is more than worth it because you look at what he does against the run. You look at what he's able to do as a pass rusher. I mean, this is a guy that has 11 straight seasons of 5 or more sacks, and he moves around. He's a D-end. He's a defensive lineman. He's going to move around a lot. He'll probably be 5 technique defensive end in their base defense, but we know that they're not in their base defense very much. He's going to move around a lot, and he's going to be a great chess piece for Wink Martindale to use on that defensive line. But he can really create some havoc and wreak some havoc on the pocket. So even if he doesn't have another 14.5 sack season like he did for Jacksonville 3 years ago, he can still be a guy that's going to be a major problem and can really help other guys in that front seven pick up some sacks and pressures and hits. So the player who came to mind immediately for me, Nestor, when this came down the pike that the Ravens were doing this was, I thought of Trevor Pryce. When you consider the size that Campbell has at 6'8", 300 pounds, Trevor Pryce, to me, is kind of the last guy the Ravens have had that kind of fits the description of...
Chris Canty was a little bit like that.
Chris Canty's a solid player, but he's nowhere close. I'm talking about impact, too.
Oh, there's no doubt at that point in his career.
And
when Trevor came with a fistful of rings, and, I'll say this about Eric DeCosta. This is where I'll jump in here. When I wrote Purple Rain 1 20 years ago, the theme that kept coming back to me from Phil Savage and from Marvin Lewis was players who were passed over. Ray Lewis, too small. Peter Boulware, you're a tweener. All of those things that they were told that diminish them. It feels to me like in the modern era, they love going and getting a Steve Smith who smells a ring, Eric Weddle who smells a ring, Earl Thomas who is pissed off, has a ring but needs another one, and Calais Campbell. Getting these really hungry guys in their 30s. And that may have been the perception of Joe Flacco that was missing a year ago in Denver, which was the perception of Joe was he's already won. He won. He's fat and happy. He got his contract. The part of this for veteran players is show me somebody that's still pissed off in 30 and has something to prove, which it always felt like Terrell Suggs was that guy, right? Even after they won the Super Bowl, we were kind of shocked that he got up and did what he did. There is something about motivation once you sort of have it all, right? And in this particular case, you want to find leadership-oriented, i.e. Weddle, do it the way I do it. Let me show you how to do it. They thought they were getting that in Earl Thomas, but probably weren't. And in Calais Campbell, you're getting a guy who's really, really hungry and a guy who is renowned for being a good guy. He's a guy you want on your team, not off of your team.
Sure, but I really think, as much as everything you said just still applies, you're talking about guys that are third contract, or in some cases maybe even a fourth contract with some of these individuals. I think, yes, there's motivation, and yes, you look at their character, and yes, you look at the factor of looking for a ring, but ultimately you want someone who can play. And
sure.
Calais Campbell has proven that for a long period of time. He's been very durable, although, as I always say to you, when you're talking about older players who have a reputation for being durable, they're that until they aren't anymore. You just know that is a cautionary tale. He's going to be 34. There's some risk here, but at the same time, you look at the course of his career, and he's missed, 6 games in his entire NFL career that goes back to 2008. So you're talking about someone who's been on the field a lot. Reminds you of Brandon Carr in that one specific way. But I think what you've seen with the Ravens here in recent years, as much as you talk about chasing a ring and guys that are motivated and guys that are high character that can be leaders, and I think it's also worth mentioning the fact that this is still a really young football team that just saw a guy like Marshall Yanda step away and retire. So Calais Campbell, Walter Payton Man of the Year, someone very active in the community in Jacksonville, in Arizona before that. So you're talking about a high-character guy, but ultimately this is a guy who's still a really, really good football player. He was ranked second among all edge defenders by Pro Football Focus last year, and they watch, and they're not the gospel, but when you're ranked second and when you're named the Run Defender of the Year by a publication that is all about watching and grading and tracking performance, that tells you you're doing something right. Whether you're truly second or not, whether you're truly the best run defender in the league or not, you're up there. And to be able to acquire Calais Campbell for the pick that they got for a kicker who has bounced around and was, the truth hurts, but kind of a flash in the pan in the preseason in Corey Vedvik, that's impressive. And that's really a piece that the Ravens needed up front. And the other thing I really like about him is when you consider how multiple this defense is, and we've talked a lot about football in the 21st century, having guys that are kind of positionless football players. And what I mean by that is that they can do different things. I mean, look at a guy like a Chuck Clark, who moved around so much on the back end and played some Mike linebacker, and they used him in different ways. Calais Campbell is that kind of chess piece up front.
Marvin Lewis would always say, he's just a football player. That's all.
Yeah,
Just a football player.
You're going to see him play on the edge. You're going to see him play at defensive tackle. You're going to see him line up at the nose. You're going to see him stunt. Probably won't see him drop into coverage unless you have some kind of Pittsburgh-like zone blitz. But he's big. He can get after the quarterback. He has 48 pass breakups in his career, which presumably virtually all of those are batted balls at the line of scrimmage.
When you're 6'8", you have longer arms than everyone else. Yes,
exactly. So there are a lot of tentacles to this as far as what Calais Campbell brings, both on the field and, as you mentioned, in the locker room, and the fact that he doesn't have a Super Bowl ring. And he even put out I saw he spoke to Jacina Anderson from ESPN and said that he's trying to win a ring, and clearly he saw what happened with the Ravens last year, being 14-2 and not being very far off. Disappointment of the Titans' loss notwithstanding. So I think this is right up there with some of the on paper, and we got to see how it plays out. Of course, we never know, and maybe he does get old overnight. But based on how he played, even last year, even at the end of last season, this is one of my favorite acquisitions that the Ravens have made at this time of year in quite some time, because I think Calais Campbell is someone who can just be that big for their front seven, and I think he steps in, and I say this with no disrespect intended to Matthew Judon even. Calais Campbell steps in and is immediately their best pass rusher, and maybe some arguments from Brandon Williams, but other than that, their best run defender in their front seven as well. So, I mean, this is a pretty big acquisition, and when you look at not having to necessarily commit multiple years, when you're talking about a shorter window here, knowing where the Ravens stand from a cap standpoint with Lamar Jackson and a record contract looming in a couple of years inevitably, I think this is the kind of move that you really look to and say, this is the kind of move that can get the Ravens over that proverbial hump, which, let's face it, I don't think there's a whole lot of improvement they need to make, but this is the kind of move that certainly fits that description for this offseason.
Luke is hanging out with us during the coronavirus COVID-19 scare. We're all homebound. He is homebound in Pennsylvania. I am homebound here at Baltimore's beautiful Inner Harbor. We're all in it together. We will continue to deliver our morning newspaper, all brought to you by Planet Fitness at planetfitness.com, as well as our text service as the Ravens continue to do stuff, including Calais Campbell. That's all brought to you, of course, by our friends at Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Dennis Kolatzis will be here Thursday. Bruce Posner's in on 7 a.m. on Monday mornings. We are going to ride this out with no baseball, no basketball, no hockey, no golf, no concerts, no Pearl Jam. Hopefully we continue with fresh vegetables around here and some other things. But the Ravens also, over the weekend, made this move on Matt Judon. And, of all the sports, we're going to talk about baseball. There is none to discuss. And Trey Mancini, we can talk about basketball and the end of college sports as we know it for the year and what it means to these kids. But for football's still, going on as if, nothing's happening, right? I'm sure there's not going to be a draft party in Las Vegas at this point, and they'll move that to next year, the next year, whatever they're going to do. I'm assuming they'll do some sort of conference call draft for television that will include cameras everywhere and Skype everywhere, and we'll all be glued to it because we're going to be out of our minds 5 weeks from now if we can't leave the house. But football's going to keep going, and I don't know if it's good or bad. The CBA over the week, football's had more news this week than anything outside of the coronavirus, quite frankly, right? And they're not going to play.
Yeah, it's kind of where they are in the schedule. Football would have been in the position of the other sports if this had happened in October. It's just kind of the timing of it all. I think it's going to be interesting to see how free agency and the start of the new league year really goes beyond the first wave, beyond the top tier of free agents, because think about it. You're not going to be seeing free agent visits for those second and third tier guys that typically would do a little tour. I think you're going to see that come to an end based on the fact that facilities are closed around the league.
If Tom Brady wants to sign with the Chargers, he can get what he gets. That's it.
Well, again, for the top free agents, I think there's probably an understanding to say, yes, pending a physical, and look, they can get medical records from other teams, and there's a certain amount of that you go into with an understanding of, barring something really weird. But I think for those second and third tier guys, I do wonder if the market slows down much more quickly, and activity settles into a lull a little sooner than most years because of that. I do think it's going to be interesting. When is there going to be a Calais Campbell introductory press conference? May? I don't know. I mean, June? I mean, it's hard to say at this point.
And will Joe Flacco show up for that one? No.
Yeah, right. But I think it is, it's difficult to really envision what this is going to look like beyond the big names. I think Sunday was a reminder, and the league already gave the indication once again, although I'll remind everyone until we actually get to the official start Wednesday, we know how quickly things change with the other sports depending on how everything goes with coronavirus. But they can conduct this work over the phone. They can do it remotely. So I think for those top-tier guys, it feels like business as usual. But beyond that, what happened? Not just press conferences and physicals, but the off-season training program begins in about a month. You would assume that's not going to happen, or at least that's going to look very different. What does that mean for OTAs? What does that mean for the draft? I mean, there are a lot of unanswered questions, but because of where the NFL is, because they're in a position where they're roughly 5.5 months away from playing in the regular season, they're still a good 5 months or close to it, 5 months away from even preseason games. So they've got some time, and I think we're all in a holding pattern, not knowing what the timetable is going to be for any of this stuff, quite frankly. Not just football, just our daily lives. But in the meantime, in the interim, while all the other sports are, at best, kind of making contingency plans. I mean, I saw ESPN had a report that the NBA's kind of preparing to not resume the season until mid-June, potentially. Meanwhile, the NFL is conducting business, and certainly people can have opinions about how much of that should even be going on, but in the meantime, I suppose it gives us something to talk about, and it gives sports fans at least something in the way of news, something in the way of looking forward to the fall and looking forward to another football season, and specifically here in Baltimore, a Ravens team that just got a lot better. So it's going to be interesting, and I do think with the Campbell acquisition on the heels of the Judon franchise tag, I am interested to see what this acquisition means for Matthew Judon, because you do look at the reality of it. The way the cap is set up right now, the Ravens don't really have a whole lot of cap space left. So is there more of an inclination to work out a long-term deal with Judon? Is there the possibility that's been there all along, but especially now that you have another piece for that front, is the possibility of trading Matt Judon? Has that increased at this point? If not, you are talking about having to make some other decisions. Brandon Carr's option, there's going to be a resolution on that at some point in the coming days. But even if you decide to keep him at a cheaper rate, you're probably looking at having to restructure a deal or two. If you're just presumably or you're assuming that Matt Judon's just playing on the franchise tag number, which is just shy of $16 million. So they have still have work to do, and we know they still have pieces to acquire, whether it's via free agency or the draft next month. So there's still work to be done, but you do look at kind of two big-ticket items added to their salary cap at this point. There's certainly some maneuvering that's going to have to go on here over the coming days and the coming weeks. But again, when you consider where the Ravens were, where they left off, as disappointing as it was, said all along, even if this team doesn't make a ton of additions from the outside and they just rely on one or two big moves and then the draft, I still think that puts them in excellent shape. So as much as we're waiting on it, as much as we're sitting in lockdown and you're watching classic college basketball games over the weekend on ESPNU, as I was, I think the Calais Campbell acquisition and the Matt Judon franchise tag certainly puts the Ravens in really good position, and that's saying something for a team coming off a 14-2 season.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and all places you can find him. He is practicing safely from home. He will be writing about all things sports. We will be discussing whenever baseball gets going and basketball gets going. You know, I'll be doing the Baltimore Positive thing here as we ramp up in an election year and a strange year for sports, dude. We'll continue our conversation. You can find me, Nasty, at WNST.net, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, all of our incredible sponsors. Please support them. Please eat at State Fair in Catonsville. Call in orders, buy gift cards, do the things that you do. Our dear friends at Amici's and Al's Seafood and Pizza John's and all of our fantastic sponsors. We'll be telling you about all of them. We've signed some new ones for the upcoming spring and summer season for Baltimore Positive. Stay with us. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports and stuff and staying safe.